Hello, for this project, I'll be talking about research in the field of literature and how writers turn research into knowledge, and so on and so forth. Thank you. For this project, I used Lander's online library and I used the EBSCO host and looked for scholarly peer reviewed articles that I could use. I used how writers research as a search term, and it actually came up with a lot of good sources and articles, a lot from editors with tips on how to research and basically the industry standards for researching and whatnot. I also found a good many articles from actual writers explaining their own process of researching. And basically, when it all came together, it came down to the processes starting out researching online sources just like we do at Lander, just like we've done in all our classes, just like we do on EBSCO. Research your online source and then obviously read it. And once you read it and get a good grasp of the paper or article or whatever it may be, you want to analyze each word or each concept that you feel is important to your project. And basically, you draw conclusions off of these words and concepts and work
I
it into
also
your own
found an
writing.
article written by the author of Water for Elephants where she tells us how she gathered knowledge about the circus in the 1920s to write in her novel. I found an article from an actual editor who tells us the best practices for researching when writing, in addition to the rest of the writing process. And another article from a professional writer who writes on all different subjects, and she tells us how difficult it can be to find information on unknown subjects, but there are definitely ways to research a topic a writer knows nothing about.
Okay, so part of the research process and finding your sources is using things like we use, like online sources, scholarly articles, and peer reviewed journals. Trusted websites, nothing like wiki anything. You can use these sources because they're just as good as a hard copy of a book, I guess, because you could go into a library and see a print resource of what you're using anyway, or you could order it from another library, whether it be online or at Lander or in Columbia or whatever. You have a lot of access to it, and you can find out whether or not it's valid. Another way is to conduct personal interviews with people who have something to do with your topic. You always want to come prepared to these interviews. You don't want to go in blind and just plan on asking them questions that you made up off the top of your head when you got there. You want to add on questions as the interview progresses to stretch it along and get more info that maybe you hadn't planned on getting before. Usually, at the end of an interview, you kind of want to ask a general question to get an answer maybe you weren't looking for, just a question that may be still about the topic, but maybe not directly related to what you're researching, and it may give you an insight into other parts of what you're doing. Another way, which I think would be a lot of fun, is a location visit. When you're writing about somewhere or something, it's good to either go to this place and kind of experience the feel and the culture of where you're at or where you're writing about, or seeing and touching something firsthand. Um, you know, maybe going to view something in a museum or other historical work type stuff. It just tells you a lot about what you're writing and makes it a whole lot easier for you. While researching this topic, I've read that basically most writers believe that fiction is less demanding than nonfiction. It's basically because if you know the subject, it's more about the creative process than the facts. It's easier to write about things you know about. Uh, for example, my class with Dr. Love this summer, she's having me write about football, and I'm not having to use a whole lot of sources on that because most of my football knowledge is firsthand, and I can just tell you because I know it, because I've grown up around it and I've done a lot of it over my lifetime. And so I'm able to write stuff that I know is true and maybe not use as many sources. The author of Water for Elephants is a person that I read a lot of her research, and she encourages writers that when they get an idea to run with it, because basically there's no limit to where your ideas and your research could take you. You could end up places that you didn't thought you would and make your paper a whole lot better or your research a whole lot better. Some questions that writers usually have when they're researching, it all depends on what kind of research they're doing and what they're doing it about. If it's historical, they want to know what the period was like, how people dressed, how they talked, what they drove, what was the popular thing to do at the time. If it's location based, basically you want to know what the place is like. You want to know what the scenery looks like, what the cities or towns or people look like that you're writing about, because you want to be write something that's inaccurate and these people read it and know that you don't know what you're talking about. They're actually from there. Um, if it's idea based, they want to know what the idea was like, how it was formed, who first came up with it, and how they should go from there. So just kind of going off what I have on the last slide, all research kind of starts with a big general question that you have about a certain topic, and that research usually leads you to online searches because it's the easiest to get to. It's easily accessible in this microwave world we live in. We want everything now, and we want to be able to tell if they're good, credible sources that'll help us in our research, or even if we actually want to do this as a topic. And that's because basically anybody can Google anything. So as long as you can Google, find out that it's a good, credible source that you can use and helps you for your project or your paper or whatever it might be for your book. Just making sure you have a good grasp of the concept and that you have good information to use. It goes more in depth. It gets more interesting, and hopefully you generate more questions as you go. This is kind of like we talked before about interviews, and I know that when I've interviewed people for stuff, I've been able to come up with stuff as we go, just kind of bouncing off their experiences and what they have to say about stuff will lead me to other questions, which gives me better insight into what they're trying to tell me in my research. Some of these questions can't be answered through online searches. You can't Google certain things. Certain things you just have to find from first-hand accounts, or at least videos or recordings of first-hand accounts, or physically, like what a place looks like we spoke about in the last slide. You can only really know if you've been there, and you can only really attest to it if you've been there. So interviewing actual witnesses or watching, videos or something of an actual witness or a person who's experienced something really helps you, as opposed to just finding stuff online and throwing it into your work. You really want to get in there and find first-hand accounts so that you can seem credible, and it just makes your overall project a whole lot better if you can find sources that better attest to what you're trying to say or answer. So, if interviews are your next step in research, you want to do your best to find experts to interview about your topic. You can't just know somebody that knows somebody that knows something about it, as Trick Daddy would say in the rap song "Let's Go." You probably have never heard of that, but you should definitely listen to it now that I've said that. Anyway, you want to find experts to interview. You can't do people if they know somebody that's experienced this or that. So one way to do it would be using encyclopedias that list companies who specialize in specific areas. If you were doing something science-based, I'm sure you could find some really good companies that have stuff to do with biology and chemistry that you could go and interview, and you find them through encyclopedias. College and universities often have professors that specialize in just one subject alone. A professor I know that I would probably go to interview if I want to do something about rhetoric. You know who you are. Or if I want to know something about Jane Eyre, I could go talk to Dr. Creighton. Also, sometimes interview questions are difficult to think of when you're not an expert on the subject. As we both clearly know, I'm not an expert with rhetoric, but I know enough about it to generate questions that I would ask you about it. If you don't know enough about it, the online research that you should do to start out with should help you formulate questions that you could ask, and then as you go, like I said before, you kind of help yourself along, and as they bounce ideas back off you during the interview, you're able to ask better questions. You also want to ask those general questions that kind of lets them give you more knowledge about the subject. So not only are you gaining information for your project, but you should learn a little something yourself if you're actually doing the interview the way you're supposed to. So once you've gathered all your research and you've gone through your online sources, your peer-reviewed journals and scholarly articles, and you've gotten your interview, if that's what you needed to do, and you've been to your location, you've gathered all the info that you need to know about the place that you're writing about and the culture that they live in and basically everything about it. You want to integrate that knowledge into your own creative process, however that you plan on doing that. You basically want to paint a picture for your audience so that they can see what you're trying to show them in the clearest light possible. You want to make sure you get your point across and you're informative and it's all very understandable. With that being said, literature can include any kind of work, any work. It could be books, whether that be fictional novels, nonfiction novels, factual textbooks, and biographies. Although when you're using factual textbooks and biographies, it's less about your creative process and more about straight facts that you're putting to paper and making sure they correlate with your question and give you good information for what you're trying to find out. They could be research papers, which is a lot of what I found for this, especially Sarah Gruen. I think Gruen's how you pronounce her last name. It's kind of spelled funny, but her research project was very good information about writers and the way they do things, or the way she does things. It could be like this PowerPoint that I'm doing right now. It's right here in your face, and you can read it, and you can listen to me talk about it, and that counts as literature also. Poems and songs, whether you hear them first person, somebody performing them, or you read them, in a library or in a book somewhere. Again, articles and blogs like you do online that you can print off, any type of those, despite the fact that they're on a computer screen, are still literature. You can still gather plenty of information from them to use. Also speeches, again, whether or not they're performed to you, you hear it firsthand, or they're written, you're still able to gather enough information, hopefully, to help you with some part of your question to do with your research.